Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you are from and what time you are watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The day we moved into our apartment in Columbus, Ohio, I was carrying boxes up the stairs when I first met Diane. She must have been in her early 50s, with dyed auburn hair that had gray roots showing. And she wore this oversized cardigan, even though it was nearly 80 degrees outside. She stood in her doorway watching us haul furniture, and when my girlfriend, Amy, and I passed by with our couch, she stepped out with a plate of cookies. "Welcome to the building," she said, her voice raspy like she'd been smoking for decades. The cookies were store-bought, still in the plastic tray, but she'd arranged them on a ceramic plate with little painted roses around the edges. I remember thinking it was sweet. This older woman living alone, trying to make us feel welcome. She told us she'd lived there for 12 years, knew everyone in the building, and if we ever needed anything, her door was always open. Within the first week, Diane knocked on our door at least once a day. First, she needed help reaching something on a high shelf. Then her television remote wasn't working, and she couldn't figure out why. After that, her cat, Mr. Whiskers, had hidden under the bed, and she couldn't coax him out. Amy and I didn't mind at first. We were both 26, healthy. And honestly, we felt bad for her. She mentioned her daughter lived in California and rarely visited. And her son had died in a motorcycle accident 5 years ago. The photos in her apartment showed a younger Diane with 2 kids at various ages. But the pictures stopped abruptly around 2010. Her place smelled like cat litter, and those plug-in air fresheners that try to smell like ocean breeze, but end up smelling like chemicals. Every surface had some kind of doily or knitted cover, and she had this collection of porcelain angels that covered an entire bookshelf where books should have been. About 3 weeks after we'd settled in, the requests started getting bigger. Diane needed a ride to the grocery store because her car was in the shop. Then she needed a ride to the pharmacy, then to her doctor's appointment across town during my lunch break. She always caught me right when I was leaving for work, standing in her doorway in that same cardigan, clutching her purse with both hands. "I hate to be a bother," she'd say, but her timing was never coincidental. She knew our schedules by then. When we left for work, when we came home, when we did laundry on Sunday afternoons. Amy started taking the back stairs to avoid her, but I felt too guilty. One morning, she asked if I could loan her $40 for her prescription pay, promising to pay me back when her Social Security check came in. Then it was 64 groceries. Then 104 part of her rent because there was some mix-up with her bank. The other tenants started warning us about her around the second month. Gerald from 3B pulled me aside in the laundry room one evening while I was waiting for the dryer to finish. He was a tall, thin man who worked night shifts at the hospital, and he usually kept to himself. "She got to you huh?" he said, not really asking. He told me Diane had done the same thing to the previous tenants in our apartment. A young couple just like us who'd lasted 8 months before breaking their lease early. The couple before them made it 6 months. Gerald had been there 4 years and learned to just not answer his door. But he said Diane had this way of making you feel like a monster if you didn't help her. "She knows exactly what she's doing," he said, folding his scrubs with precise, angry movements. "She picks the young ones, the nice ones, the ones who were raised to respect their elders." He said she borrowed nearly $300 from the previous couple and never paid them back, always having some excuse about waiting for insurance money or a pension check that never seemed to arrive. Amy wanted us to start saying no after that conversation with Gerald, and we tried. The next morning, when Diane knocked, we didn't answer. She knocked again, harder. Then again. "I know you are in there," she called through the door, her voice different than usual, sharper, with an edge I hadn't heard before. "I can hear you moving around. I just need a quick ride to the bank." We stayed quiet, barely breathing, and eventually, she left. But that evening, when we came home from work, she was sitting on the stairs by our door, that cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders. She looked up at us with watery eyes and said her cat was sick and she couldn't afford the vet bill. She actually had tears rolling down her cheeks, and her hands trembled as she dabbed at them with a tissue. Amy walked past her without a word, but I stopped. I couldn't help it. Mr. Whiskers had seemed fine when I'd seen him the week before, but what if he really was sick? What if this one time she actually needed help? I gave her $80 that night for the vet, and Amy barely spoke to me afterward. She said I was enabling her, that Diane was playing me like a fiddle. And she was probably right. But here is the thing about manipulation. Even when you know it's happening, even when you can see all the strings being pulled, sometimes you still can't stop yourself from dancing to the tune. Diane had this gift for making her problems feel urgent, immediate, like catastrophes that only you could solve. She'd stand there with her shoulders hunched, looking small and fragile, and you'd forget about all the money she already owed you. You'd forget about Gerald's warnings. You'd forget about the way she timed her emergencies for maximum impact. 2 days later, I saw Mr. Whiskers lounging in her window, perfectly healthy, grooming himself in the afternoon sun. When I mentioned it to Diane, she said the medication worked miracles. But she couldn't quite meet my eyes when she said it. Things escalated during month 3. Diane started showing up at her hours with increasingly dramatic stories. Her nephew in Michigan needed emergency surgery, and she had to wire money immediately. Her ex-husband was threatening to take her to court over some old debt. The apartment management was saying she was behind on rent and would be evicted by Friday if she didn't pay. Each crisis required $200, $300, sometimes $500. I'd already given her close to $600 by then, and Amy had reached her breaking point. We had a massive fight about it one night, the kind where you say things you can't take back. She accused me of caring more about a manipulative old woman than our own relationship, our own financial goals. We were supposed to be saving for a house, planning our future together, and here I was, hemorrhaging money to someone who saw me as nothing but an ATM with a guilty conscience. Amy slept on the couch that night, and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd let it get this bad. The next morning was a Saturday in late September. One of those perfect fall days where the air feels clean and sharp. I was making coffee when I heard Diane's voice through the wall. She was on the phone, and she was laughing, not the fragile, desperate voice she used with us, but full-throated, genuine laughter. No. The kids next door are good for it, I heard her say clearly. Young professionals, you know the type. They can't stand to see an old lady struggle. She laughed again, and I heard her mention something about having enough for the cruise deposit. Amy was standing behind me by then, and we both listened as Diane went on about her plans, about how she'd figured out the perfect system. She said she kept a notebook tracking what she'd told to whom, making sure her stories didn't overlap. She mentioned us by our apartment number, not our names, like we were just entries in a ledger. That's when Amy grabbed her phone and started recording, holding it up to the wall to catch Diane's voice. We stopped answering Diane's knocks after that. We'd hear her outside our door, sometimes for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, knocking with increasing aggression. She'd slip notes under the door, long, rambling letters about how we were heartless, how she thought we were different, how she'd be on the street because of us. One note mentioned that she knew where we worked, knew our car, knew our family's names from the mail she'd seen. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't not a threat either. Gerald told us she'd done similar things to the others who'd cut her off and that eventually, she'd move on to newer tenants. Sure enough, when a young woman named Beth moved into Fora 2 weeks later, we watched Diane shift her attention like a predator choosing easier prey. We tried to warn Beth, but Diane had already gotten to her with stories about how the other tenants were jealous of her, how they spread lies because they didn't like old people. Beth looked at us with suspicion when we tried to explain, and I could see in her eyes that Diane had already won the first round. October turned into November, and we developed a routine of avoidance. We knew when she went to get her mail, when she sat in the lobby, when she prowled the hallways looking for someone to corner. The building felt different now, charged with a constant, low-level anxiety. Other tenants had similar stories. The Gunyans in Tennessee said she'd gotten $400 from them before they caught in. And the old man in one, just laughed bitterly when her name came up. But we all stayed because leases are hard to break. And moving is expensive, and somehow we'd all convinced ourselves that we could outlast her. Then came that night in mid-November, a Thursday around 11 p.m. I was brushing my teeth when I heard the sirens, distant at first, but getting louder, closer, until they were right outside our building. Blue and red lights flashed through the bathroom window, painting the walls in alternating colors. Amy and I went to the living room window and saw 3 police cars, then 4. Then an ambulance. The hallway filled with neighbors, everyone in various states of undress, pajamas, robes, hastily thrown on sweatshirts. We all watched as 2 officers knocked on Diane's door, then knocked harder, then announced themselves as police. When she finally opened it, she was in that same cardigan. But her face was different, blank, almost serene. They told her she needed to come with them for questioning, and she just nodded like she'd been expecting it. As they led her past us, she looked at each neighbor with this strange, distant expression, like we were strangers she'd never seen before. Gerald was standing next to me, and he whispered that her brother in Portland had been found dead 2 days ago under suspicious circumstances. The word poisoning floated through the crowd of neighbors, along with insurance money and power of attorney. Someone mentioned that Diane had visited him last month, the first time in years, right after he'd been diagnosed with cancer. The detective who came to question us the next day wouldn't confirm details, but he asked a lot of questions about Diane's financial situation, her requests for money, her stories about family members we never saw. We never saw Diane again after that night. Her apartment was cleaned out a week later by people in hazmat suits. Apparently, the conditions inside were worse than any of us had imagined. The smell that leaked out when they opened the door was indescribable, and they found dozens of those notebooks she'd mentioned, filled with detailed records of her interactions with tenants going back years. My name was in there, along with notes about my weakness for sob stories and Catholic guilt. Very useful. Amy found her name too, marked as tougher. Work around her. The building management told us later that she'd never actually been behind on rent. She had plenty of money in her accounts. The requests for cash, the desperate stories, the tears, tea had all been some kind of game to her, a way to feel powerful maybe, or just the thrill of seeing what she could make people do. We got a letter months later saying the case against her was moving forward, but we never learned the outcome. Amy and I moved out when our lease ended, found a place across town where nobody knew us. We're more careful now, slower to trust, quicker to see the angles people might be playing. Sometimes I still think about Beth. Wonder if she ever figured it out before Diane was arrested, or if she was still bringing groceries to an empty apartment, knocking on a door that would never open again. Two years ago, I was living in a duplex in Denver with my 8-year-old daughter, Lily. I had just finalized my divorce and was trying to rebuild our lives from scratch. The place wasn't much, peeling paint on the shutters, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 80s, and a backyard that was more weeds than grass, but it was ours, and that's all that mattered. I was working as a dental hygienist at a practice downtown, pulling long hours to make ends meet. Most evenings, I'd come home exhausted, help Lily with homework, make dinner, and collapse into bed by 10 o'clock. Life was predictable, routine, and honestly, that's exactly what we needed after the chaos of the previous year. The neighborhood was quiet. Mostly older folks who'd lived there for decades, which made me feel safe as a single mom. Our next-door neighbor, Walter, moved in about 3 months after we did. He was probably in his early 50s, always wearing the same faded blue coveralls and a John Deere cap that had seen better days. The first time we met, he was carrying boxes from a beat-up Ford pickup truck, and I offered to help. He had this peculiar way of never quite making eye contact, always looking just past your ear like something more interesting was happening behind you. His teeth were stained yellow from what I assumed was years of coffee and cigarettes, and he had this habit of clicking his tongue before he spoke, like he was tasting his words first. Walter worked nights at some warehouse across town, which meant our schedules rarely overlapped, but whenever we did cross paths, he was friendly enough. Always asking about Lily's school or commenting on the weather, nothing that would make you think twice. The borrowing started small. Maybe 6 weeks after Walter moved in. First, it was a hammer. He knocked on my door one Saturday afternoon, while Lily was at a friend's birthday party. He said he was putting up shelves and his hammerhead had flown off the handle, nearly taking out his kitchen window. I laughed and grabbed mine from the garage, told him to keep it as long as he needed. He returned it the next morning, clean and wrapped in a dish towel like it was something precious. Then it was a screwdriver set, then pliers, then my electric drill. Each time, he had these elaborate explanations. The screwdriver rolled under his refrigerator and he couldn't reach it. The pliers got mixed up in a box he'd already taken to storage. The drill bit snapped right in the middle of a project. He'd always stand on my porch, shifting his weight from foot to foot, that tongue click happening every few seconds. The tools always came back, usually within a day or two, sometimes cleaner than when I'd lent them. After a while, the requests got more frequent and more specific. He needed my measuring tape, but specifically the long one. Not the short one he'd seen me use in the garden. He needed aluminum foil because the store brand he bought kept tearing. He needed batteries, but only the Duracell ones because the generic ones didn't last in his flashlight. One evening in July, he knocked while I was giving Lily a bath, asking if he could borrow my vacuum cleaner because his had sucked up something it shouldn't have and stopped working. I remember standing there in my doorway, still drying my hands on my jeans, and noticing how he kept peering past me into the house, his eyes scanning the living room like he was memorizing the layout. But I brushed it off. Maybe he was just curious about how we decorated. Or maybe he was one of those people who couldn't help but look. The vacuum came back 2 days later, with a new bag installed, to thank, taped to the handle by August. Walter's requests had become part of my weekly routine. Every few days, there'd be that distinctive knock, 3 quick taps. Pause, then 2 more. I'd find him on my porch with another need. But here is where things started getting weird. I came home from work one Thursday earlier than usual because Lily had a dentist appointment and found my spare key missing from under the ceramic frog where I kept it. I tore apart the porch looking for it, thinking maybe the wind had knocked it somewhere, but it was gone. That same evening, Walter knocked and asked if he could borrow some sugar. While I was in the kitchen getting it, I mentioned the missing key, and he immediately offered to help me look. He spent 20 minutes crawling around my porch with a flashlight, checking every corner and crevice. The next morning, the key was back under the frog, exactly where it should have been. When I thanked Walter for finding it, he looked confused and said he hadn't found anything. Thought I must have located it myself. Then came the Saturday that changed everything. Lily was at her dad's for the weekend, and I decided to deep clean the house. I was organizing my home office when I realized my passport wasn't in the filing cabinet where I always kept it. My birth certificate was there, Lily's was there, but my passport was gone. I pulled everything out, checked every folder twice. Even looked behind the cabinet thinking it might have fallen. Nothing. That's when I noticed other things were off. The stack of bank statements I kept paper clipped together had been shuffled, still there, but in a different order than I'd left them. My social security card was in the wrong slot. The folder with Lily's medical records had been moved from the third drawer to the second. Small things. Things you might not notice unless you were looking, but I am meticulous about my filing system. I've been that way since the divorce, when keeping track of every document became crucial for custody arrangements. I sat there on my office floor, surrounded by papers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My laptop was still on the desk, my jewelry box untouched in the bedroom. The emergency cash I kept in an old coffee tin was all there. Nothing valuable was missing, except for that passport. But someone had definitely been through my personal documents. Someone who was careful enough to put things back almost exactly where they belonged. I thought about calling the police. But what would I say? That my papers were in a slightly different order? That my passport was missing, but nothing else? They'd probably think I was paranoid or had simply misplaced it myself. I spent the rest of that afternoon checking every window lock, every door, looking for signs of forced entry. Everything was secure. The only explanation was that someone had used a key. And the only key that had gone missing was the spare under the frog. That evening around 7 p.m., Walter knocked. This time, he wanted to borrow my stepladder to change a light bulb in his hallway. Apparently, his ceiling was unusually high, and his regular ladder wouldn't reach. I stood in my doorway, studying his face while he talked, looking for something. Anything that would confirm my suspicions. He did that tongue. Clicked thing 3 times in 30 seconds. And his eyes kept drifting to the living room behind me, but what really caught my attention was a small detail. He had a paper cut on his index finger, fresh enough that it was still slightly bleeding through the band aid. When I asked about it, he laughed and said he'd been sorting through old mail, got careless with an envelope. I lent him the ladder, but as soon as he left, I went back to my office. Sure enough, one of my bank statement envelopes had a tiny speck of blood on the corner, so small I hadn't noticed it before. My whole body went cold. This man had been in my house, going through my private documents, touching my things. And now he was standing on my porch asking to borrow my ladder like nothing had happened. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow outside my window looked like someone trying to get in. I called in sick to work Monday and installed new deadbolts on all the doors, plus one of those chain locks on the front and back. I bought a security camera system from Best Buy, the kind that sends alerts to your phone when it detects motion. While I was setting it up, I found something that made me physically sick. In Lily's room, tucked behind her dresser, was one of my old pay stubs from 3 months ago. I knew for certain I'd never brought it into her room. I always dealt with financial stuff in my office, but there was something else on the back of the pay stub. Someone had written in pencil, very lightly, a series of numbers. When I looked closer, I realized it was my work schedule, exact hours and days I'd worked that month. Someone had been tracking my routine, knowing exactly when I'd be gone and for how long. The handwriting was small and cramped. Nothing like mine. I took pictures of everything with my phone, finally having some form of evidence. The next morning, Tuesday, I was reviewing the security camera footage from overnight, when I saw something that confirmed everything. At 3:47 a.m., Walter had walked up to my porch, stood directly in front of my door for about 30 seconds, then walked away. He didn't knock, didn't try the handle, just stood there. Then, at 4:15 am, he was back. This time walking around to my back door, again just standing there before leaving. The footage was clear enough to see him holding something in his hand. It looked like a key. I called the police immediately. But the officer who came by seemed skeptical. Walter hadn't actually entered the property on camera. Hadn't done anything explicitly illegal. Standing on someone's porch wasn't a crime. The officer suggested I change my locks and document everything, maybe look into a restraining order if things escalated. After he left, I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house changed that afternoon. I also called my ex-SA husband and asked if Lily could stay with him for a few extra days while I sorted this out that Wednesday evening. Walter knocked on my door again. I watched him through the peephole but didn't answer. He knocked 3 more times over the course of an hour, each time waiting about 5 minutes before trying again. Through the security camera app on my phone, I could see him clearly. He was holding a pie dish. Presumably another excuse to make contact. After the 4th attempt, he set the dish on my porch and walked back to his house. But he didn't go inside. Instead, he sat on his front steps, directly facing my house, and stayed there for 2 hours. Just sitting, watching, occasionally taking sips from a thermos. I called 911, but since he was on his own property, they said there was nothing they could do. I sat in my dark living room, peeking through the blinds, watching him watch my house. Finally, around 10 p.m., he went inside. The pie dish sat on my porch for 3 days before I threw it away, unopened. I never spoke to Walter again, but I could feel him watching whenever I came and went. His curtains would move. His door would crack open just slightly. I documented everything, built a case file that was 2 inches thick. A month later, I found out from another neighbor, Mrs. Gutierrez, that Walter had been evicted. She said the landlord had found some disturbing things in his house during a routine inspection. Dozens of women's IDs, photocopied and taped to his bedroom wall, boxes full of mail that wasn't his, and what appeared to be detailed logs about multiple neighbors' schedules and routines. The police got involved. But Walter disappeared before they could question him. They found my passport in his kitchen drawer, along with 2 credit cards I didn't even know were missing. Mrs. Gutierrez said they also found a key, making kit and several blank keys. The detective who called me said Walter's real name wasn't even Walter. It was Douglas Brennan. And he had a history of identity theft and stalking in 3 other states. We moved out 2 weeks later. I still check my credit report obsessively, still triple check my locks. Still feel that crawling sensation whenever a neighbor acts too friendly. Lily doesn't know the full story. Just that we needed a fresh start. Sometimes I wonder how many times he was in our house while we slept, what else he touched. What else he took that I never noticed. The not knowing is almost worse than what I actually discovered. The 4 of us had been sharing that house in the suburbs of Phoenix for about 8 months when everything went to hell. It was February 2018, and I was 26, working remotely as a graphic designer, while my roommates, Jason, Maria, and Steve, Etrell had regular office jobs downtown. We'd found this perfect two-story rental with a huge backyard, thinking we'd scored big with the cheap rent and quiet neighborhood. The place had this old wooden fence around the back, maybe 7 feet tall, with a metal gate that connected to the alley running between our street and the one behind us. We'd throw barbecues every weekend, stay up late playing music on the patio. Really living our best 20-something's life without a care in the world. The houses around us were mostly families and older couples who kept to themselves. which suited us just fine. The first time we heard the banging, it was a Tuesday night around 2 a.m. And I remember because I'd stayed up late finishing a project for a client in Japan. 3 heavy slams against our back gate, kind that made the whole fence rattle and echo through the yard. Jason came stumbling out of his room with a baseball bat, and we stood there in the kitchen, hearts pounding, waiting for something else to happen. After about 5 minutes of silence, we figured maybe it was just some drunk kid from the community college nearby trying to take a shortcut through the alley. We laughed it off, made some jokes about Jason's superhero stance with the bat, and went back to bed. But then it happened again the next night, same time. Same 3 heavy bangs that seemed to shake the entire fence line, followed by what sounded like someone testing the gate latch truck, metallic clicking noise of someone pulling and pushing at it repeatedly. By the end of that week, the noises had evolved into something way worse. We'd hear footsteps crunching through the gravel along the side of our house, slow and deliberate, like someone was taking their time checking out the property. Maria set up her phone to record from her bedroom window one night, and we caught this grainy footage of 2 figures walking around our backyard, just wandering between our shed and the patio furniture. They weren't trying to steal anything, just walking around, occasionally stopping to peer into our windows. Steve wanted to call the cops right away, but the video was too dark to make out any faces, and technically, they hadn't broken anything or tried to get inside the house. We decided to install motion sensor lights instead. These super bright lit floods that would blast the entire yard with white light if anything moved back there. The guy at Home Depot helped us pick out the most obnoxious ones they had, 3,000 lumens each. Enough to blind anyone who triggered them. That Saturday afternoon, while Steve and I were upon ladders installing the lights, we finally met our back neighbors for the first time. These 2 guys came out onto their deck, which overlooked our yard, and just stood there watching us work. The younger one, probably mid-30s with a patchy beard and sunken cheeks, kept giggling at nothing while scratching at his arms. The older guy, maybe 50, with this yellowed tank top hanging off his skinny frame, started asking us weird questions about whether we had any power tools he could borrow, if we knew where to get car batteries cheap, random stuff that didn't quite connect. Their eyes had this glassy, unfocused quality, pupils like pinpoints even though it was bright out. And they both had these scabs all over their faces and arms. The smell coming from their direction was absolutely rank, like chemicals mixed with rotting garbage and body odor. Strong enough that I could taste it in the back of my throat, even from 20 feet away. Steve tried to be polite, giving vague answers about not having extra tools, while I stayed quiet and focused on screwing in the light fixtures. The younger guy suddenly got agitated, started pacing on their deck and mumbling about how we were putting up cameras to spy on them, how the government uses lead lights to read people's thoughts, completely paranoid nonsense. The older one just laughed this dry, wheezing sound and said we seemed like nice kids, then asked if we ever needed any electronics fixed, because he was really good at taking things apart. The way he said it made my skin prickle with unease. They went back inside after about 10 minutes, but I could see them through their sliding glass door, just standing in their dark living room, watching us finish the installation. Later that evening, Maria looked up the property records online and found out the house was a rental managed by some company based in Nevada, with a history of complaints from the neighborhood association about trash, noise, and suspicious activity going back 3 years. The motion lights worked great for exactly 2 nights. On the 3rd night, around 1 a.m., they started going off every few minutes, flooding our backyard with harsh white light. We'd rushed to the windows but never saw anything, just an empty yard and shadows. Then we noticed the lights were slightly tilted, aimed away from the fence line toward the house, like someone had manually adjusted them. Jason found fresh scratches on the metal housing and what looked like grease marks on the wall below, as if someone had climbed up to mess with them. We also discovered our garbage cans had been opened and rifled through, with specific items missing: old electronics, batteries from a broken remote, some copper wire Steve had thrown out from a speaker repair project. Weird. Selective theft that made no sense until Maria Googled it, and found out those were all components people use to make homemade meth pipes or to trade for drugs. Things escalated dramatically the following Thursday. I woke up at 3 a.m. to Maria screaming from downstairs. She'd gotten up for water and found the younger neighbor guy standing in our backyard, face pressed against the sliding glass door, hands cupped around his eyes, trying to see inside. When she flipped on the patio light, he didn't run, just stood there staring at her with this blank expression, swaying slightly, his mouth moving like he was talking to himself. She was banging on Jason's door when the guy finally turned and walked slowly back toward the fence. But instead of leaving through the gate, he tried to climb over, getting his shirt caught on the top and hanging there for a solid minute, struggling and cursing before finally ripping free and dropping to the other side. We called the police this time, but by the time they showed up 40 minutes later, there was nothing to see except some torn fabric on the fence. The cops took a report, said they'd increase patrols, gave us the usual speech about keeping doors locked and staying vigilant. But we could tell they weren't going to do much about it. The next morning, I was working from home when I heard Steve yelling from the backyard. He'd gone out to check the shed and found the lock had been destroyed, not cut, but literally smashed with something heavy. The metal twisted and mangled. Inside, our lawnmower was partially disassembled, with the copper motor windings pulled out and missing. They'd also taken the gas can, some old paint thinner, and, bizarrely, a box of rock salt we used for making ice cream, but the really disturbing part was what they'd left behind. A glass pipe with burn marks on one end, hidden behind where the mower had been, along with a dirty sleeping bag that reeked of that same chemical smell. Steve put on gloves and threw everything in a garbage bag, but we were all thoroughly freaked out, knowing they'd been using our shed as some kind of hideout or stash spot, possibly for weeks without us knowing. That weekend, we decided to confront the situation head-on. All four of us marched over to their front door around noon, figuring they'd be less aggressive during daylight hours. The older guy answered after about 5 minutes of knocking, wearing nothing but stained boxers, his ribs showing through pale, mottled skin. The living room behind him was chaos. Mattresses on the floor, aluminum foil covering all the windows, burn marks on the carpet, and at least 6 other people sprawled around in various states of consciousness. He kept insisting he didn't know anything about anyone going in our yard, but his hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold the door, and I could see fresh scratches all over his arms that looked exactly like the marks on our fence. When Jason mentioned we had security footage and were considering pressing charges, the guy's whole demeanor changed. He started rambling about how we didn't understand what it was like, how they were just trying to get by, how the younger guy, apparently his nephew, sometimes got confused at night and wandered around when he'd had too much, before we could respond. 3 more people emerged from the back of the house, including the younger guy we'd seen before. He was in way worse shape than the last time, massive weight loss, teeth visibly rotting, open sores on his face that looked infected. He started screaming at his uncle for talking to us, saying we were probably wearing wires, that we'd planted listening devices in their walls through the shared fence. Then he turned to us and his whole face changed, got this weird, calm expression, and he asked if we wanted to buy a motorcycle. When we said no, he asked if we had any bikes in our shed he could fix up and sell, like he hadn't just admitted to knowing what was in our shed. Maria lost it at that point. Told them if anyone from their house stepped foot on our property again, we'd have them arrested for trespassing and drug possession. The younger guy laughed this horrible, dry cackle, and said we couldn't prove anything, that maybe we were the ones with drug problems trying to frame innocent neighbors. The older guy tried to calm him down, but then two more people pushed past us to leave. One of them carrying what was clearly our stolen gas can, still with Steve's initials written on it in Sharpie. That night was the worst, and thankfully, the last. Around midnight, we heard glass breaking downstairs. Jason grabbed his bat again while I called 911. And we crept down to find our kitchen window completely shattered. A brick lying in the middle of the floor surrounded by glass shards. Through the broken window, we could see flames in the backyard. They'd set our shed on fire. The whole structure was engulfed. Toxic black smoke billowing up into the night sky. While we were standing there in shock, the motion lights revealed 5 or 6 figures running around our yard, some throwing more stuff onto the fire, others trying to grab our patio furniture. The younger neighbor was there, shirt off, dancing around the flames and howling like an animal. Steve ran outside with the garden hose, but they'd already cut it, sliced clean through in multiple places. By the time the fire department arrived, the shed was completely destroyed. The fence was charred, and the tweakers had scattered back to their house or into the alley. The firefighters said the accelerant pattern suggested they'd used the stolen paint thinner and gasoline to start it. And the weird colored flames were probably from chemicals they'd thrown in, possibly from their own drug, making supplies. The police arrested 7 people from the house that night, including both neighbors we'd been dealing with. Turns out they'd been running a small meth operation in their bathroom, and the fire investigation gave probable cause for a search warrant. The cops found 2 pounds of methamphetamine, a mobile cooking setup, stolen property from at least 12 different houses in the neighborhood, and 3 people with outstanding warrants. The younger guy tried to fight the cops and ended up getting tased in his front yard while screaming that we'd orchestrated the whole thing, that we were CIA agents sent to destroy his research. We had to stay in a hotel for 3 days while hazmat crews cleaned up the chemical contamination from our backyard. Our landlord let us break the lease without penalty, and we were moved out within 2 weeks. I drove by there about 6 months later, and both houses were empty, with condemned notices on the doors. Sometimes I still dream about that younger guy's face pressed against our glass door, those dead eyes just staring. And I wake up checking all my locks twice before I can get back to sleep. It was a Thursday afternoon in late August when everything went sideways. I was 16, just starting my junior year at Lincoln High in Raleigh, and my mom had left for a 3-day nursing conference in Charlotte. She'd kissed me goodbye that morning, rattling off the usual list of reminders about locking doors, not having parties, and calling if I needed anything. I remember rolling my eyes and telling her I'd be fine, that I wasn't a kid anymore. The house felt different with her gone, though bigger, somehow, like all the familiar corners had stretched out and become unfamiliar. I'd spent the morning playing video games and eating cereal straight from the box, enjoying the freedom of having the place to myself. Our neighborhood in North Raleigh was one of those quiet subdivisions where nothing ever happened. Just rows of 2-story houses with neat lawns and the occasional barking dog around 2 in the afternoon. I heard a knock at the door. Through the peephole, I saw Mr. Garrison from 3 houses down. He was this guy in his early 40s whom my mom always described as such a helpful neighbor. Clean shaven, always wearing polo shirts and khakis, the kind of guy who'd help you carry groceries or start your car without being asked. He had this easy smile and would wave whenever he jogged past our house in the mornings. My mom had mentioned him dozens of times. How he'd fixed our mailbox after some kids knocked it over. How he'd brought us cookies when we first moved in 5 years ago. He was standing there on our porch, shifting his weight from foot to foot, and when I opened the door, I noticed he was sweating more than usual for such a mild day. His polo shirt had dark patches under the arms, and he kept wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Hey Demi buddy," he said. And his voice had this weird urgency to it that I'd never heard before. "I am really sorry to bother you. But my phone died and I locked myself out of the house. My wife won't be home for another few hours. And I really need to make an important call about a job interview. Could I use your phone real quick? I'll just be a minute." "I promise." He held up his cell phone, showing me the black screen, and gave me that familiar, friendly smile. Though it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. I hesitated for maybe 2 seconds. My mom's voice in my head warning me about letting people in when I was alone. But this was Mr. Garrison. The guy who'd helped my mom change a flat tire last winter, who always asked how school was going when he saw me. Besides, he looked genuinely stressed, and I figured a quick phone call couldn't hurt. I stepped aside and let him in, pointing toward the kitchen where we kept our landline. He followed me through the living room, and I noticed he was walking differently than usual, taking these quick, measured steps like he was trying not to make noise. His eyes darted around our house, taking in the family photos on the mantel, the stack of mail on the coffee table. Even glancing up the stairs toward the bedrooms. "Nice place," he mumbled. Though he'd been inside before when he'd helped my mom move our old refrigerator to the garage, in the kitchen. He picked up the phone but didn't dial right away. Instead, he stood there holding the receiver, staring at the numbers like he'd forgotten who he was supposed to call. After what felt like forever but was probably only 10 seconds, he started dialing. I could hear the buttons beeping. But something about the rhythm seemed wrong. Too many numbers, or maybe not enough. I couldn't tell for sure because I was trying not to seem like I was watching him too closely. The conversation he had was bizarre. He spoke in this low, hushed voice, saying things like, "Yeah, I know, and can't do that right now, and give me more time." No mention of a job interview, no professional tone. Nothing that matched what he'd told me at the door. His free hand gripped the edge of our kitchen counter so hard his knuckles went white, and I saw a strange mark on his wrist. Like a red line where something had been wrapped tight around it recently. When he hung up after maybe 90 seconds, he turned to me with this forced, casual expression and said, "Thanks, kid. Mind if I use your bathroom before I go?" Before I could answer, he was already moving toward our downstairs bathroom. But then he stopped, changed direction, and headed toward the laundry room instead. "Actually, W, here is your back door. I'll just cut through your yard if that's okay." The laundry room did lead to our back door, but something about the way he said it made every hair on my arm stand up. That's when we heard it. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. Not a normal neighbor knock, but authoritative, demanding. Mr. Garrison's whole body went rigid, and the color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. Without a word, he practically dove into our laundry room and pulled the door shut behind him. Through the frosted glass panels of our front door, I could see to shapes, and when I peered through the peephole, my heart started hammering against my ribs. 2 police officers stood there, hands resting on their duty belts, their expressions serious and alert. The taller one, a black woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, knocked again and called out, "Police department. We need to speak with anyone inside." My mouth went completely dry. Mr. Garrison was hiding in my laundry room. And cops were at my door, and suddenly all those weird details, Lester sweating, the strange phone call, that mark on his wrist, crashed together in my mind like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. I stood there for what must have been 5 seconds but felt like 5 minutes, my hand hovering near the doorknob. Through the thin laundry room door, I could hear Mr. Garrison breathing, these shallow, rapid breaths like he'd just run a marathon. The officers knocked a 3rd time, harder now, and the woman called out again. "We know someone's home." We saw movement through the window. My legs felt like they were made of water. But somehow I managed to open the door, keeping the chain on. Yes? My voice came out higher than normal, cracking on that single word like I was 13 again. The male officer, a stocky white guy with a graying mustache, held up his badge. "Son, we're looking for a man who was seen in this neighborhood about 15 minutes ago. Robert Garrison. Lives a few houses down. Have you seen him?" The way he said it, not asking if Mr. Garrison was here, but if I'd seen him, gave me this tiny window, this chance to maybe not be the kid harboring a fugitive in his laundry room. "What did he do?" I asked, stalling, trying to keep my voice steady while my brain raced through options. The female officer exchanged a look with her partner before answering. "He's wanted for questioning in connection with an embezzlement case. His employer reported over $200,000 missing. And Mr. Garrison didn't show up for a meeting with investigators this morning. His car was found abandoned at a rest stop off I-40. She pulled out her phone, showing me a photo that was definitely Mr. Garrison, though in the picture he was wearing a suit and tie, looking like any other suburban dad. He's not dangerous, but we need to find him. His wife said he left their house acting erratic about an hour ago. Not dangerous. The words should have been reassuring, but all I could think about was that he was hiding in my house, breathing hard behind a door just 15 feet away. And these cops had no idea how close they were to catching him. My palms were slick with sweat, and I had to wipe them on my jeans before they noticed. "I haven't seen him," I said, the lie burning in my throat like acid. "I've been home all day playing games, haven't even looked outside much." The male officer leaned forward slightly, and I caught a whiff of coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "Mind if we come in and have a quick look around? Just to be thorough?" This was it, the moment where everything would unravel. I could feel Mr. Garrison behind that laundry room door, probably pressed against it, listening to every word. "My mom's not home," I said quickly. "She told me not to let anyone in when she's gone, even police officers. She's really strict about that." It wasn't entirely a lie. My mom had given me that talk about being careful, though I am pretty sure she would have made an exception for actual cops with badges. The female officer nodded slowly, but her eyes were scanning what she could see of our house through the gap in the chain door. "Smart mom. How about this? Is there a number where we can reach her? We'd like to check with all the neighbors." I rattled off my mom's cell number, knowing she was probably in the middle of some conference session and wouldn't answer. The officers wrote it down, then handed me a business card. "If you see Mr. Garrison, don't approach him, just call us immediately, okay?" "And son?" The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and I swear she could see straight through my skull to all the lies bouncing around inside. "You sure you are okay? You seem nervous." I forced out this awkward laugh that sounded nothing like my normal laugh. "Yeah. Just never had cops at my door before. It's kind of intense." She studied me for another second that stretched like taffy, then finally stepped back. "Lock your doors and stay inside. We'll have units in the area for the next few hours." I watched them walk back to their cruiser, a white sedan with the city police logo on the side. They sat there for a minute, probably running my mom's information. And I stood frozen at the door, knowing that Mr. Garrison was waiting, listening, probably planning his next move. The cruiser finally pulled away, moving slowly down our street, and I watched until it turned the corner. The moment they were gone, the laundry room door creaked open, and Mr. Garrison emerged looking like a completely different person. His friendly neighbor mask had slipped off entirely, replaced by someone desperate and calculating. His polo shirt was soaked through now, and his hands were trembling as he ran them through his disheveled hair. "You did good, kid. Really good," he said. But there was something in his tone that made it sound less like gratitude and more like an assessment. He moved toward the kitchen window, peering through the blinds at the street. "I need you to do one more thing for me. I need to borrow your bike from the garage. Just until tonight. I'll bring it back, I swear." The way he said it, I knew he'd never bring it back. I also knew I didn't have much choice. This wasn't the helpful neighbor who'd fixed our mailbox anymore. This was a man backed into a corner, and cornered animals do unpredictable things. "Take it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just please leave." He studied me for a long moment, and then his expression softened slightly. "I am not a bad person, you know. Sometimes good people make terrible mistakes. And then those mistakes snowball until you are standing in a teenager's laundry room hiding from the cops." He went out through the back door, and I watched from the window as he wheeled my mountain bike out of our garage, keeping to the shadows between houses. Before he left, he turned back and looked at me through the glass door, raising his hand in this sad little wave that made him look broken and human and guilty all at once. Then he was gone. Pedaling down the alley behind our houses, hunched over the handlebars like he was trying to make himself smaller, I stood there in my empty house, adrenaline still coursing through my veins, and called my mom. When she answered on the third ring, sounding confused and concerned, I told her everything. About Mr. Garrison, the police, the bike, all of it. She left the conference immediately and drove home, calling the police on the way. They found Mr. Garrison that evening at a motel 2 towns over, still with my bike. The money he'd stolen was never fully recovered, and his family moved away a month later. I still think about that afternoon sometimes, about how quickly someone familiar can become a stranger, and how one moment of desperation can unravel an entire life. The new people who moved into the Garrison house seem nice enough, but I never answer the door when I am home alone anymore. Most people dream about quiet neighborhoods with friendly faces and weekend barbecues, right? Well, let me tell you about what happened in our little Cul-de-Sac last spring that completely shattered that illusion for me and my family. I am a 34-year-old electrician. Been living in the same house in suburban Illinois for about 6 years now with my wife and our 2 kids, ages 7 and 9. We'd moved there specifically because it seemed like the perfect place to raise children. Just 8 houses arranged in a peaceful circle, mature oak trees lining the street, and neighbors who actually waved when they saw you. The Cul-de-Sac had this unspoken rhythm to it, you know? Lawn mowers on Saturday mornings, kids playing street hockey until the streetlights came on, and the occasional impromptu gathering when someone fired up their grill. It was exactly what we'd wanted when we left our cramped apartment in the city. Everything changed when Harold Garrison moved into the yellow house at the end of the circle. About 3 months before that terrible day in May, he was probably in his late 50s. Always wore these faded polo shirts tucked into khaki shorts that were pulled up way too high, and had this peculiar way of walking where he'd pause every few steps like he was counting something in his head. At first, we all tried to be welcoming. My wife, the mall Janet, even brought him a casserole that first week. Though he barely opened the door wide enough to take it from her, he never returned the dish, by the way. Within 2 weeks of moving in, Harold had installed for security cameras on his property, which seemed excessive but not completely unreasonable, given how paranoid some people are these days. But then we started noticing him standing in his driveway with this old camcorder, just kind from the early 2000s with the flip-out screen, just openly recording our houses for 20 to 30 minutes at a time. The first note appeared on a Monday morning, stuck under the windshield wiper of my neighbor Bill's truck. Bill lived 2 houses down from me, a nice guy who worked construction and had this habit of tapping his wedding ring against surfaces when he was thinking. He brought the note over to show me while I was loading my work van, and I'll never forget how his usually steady voice cracked a little when he read it out loud. The note was written in this cramped, angry handwriting with a black ballpoint pen that had been pressed so hard it tore through the paper in places. It said Bill's truck was too loud when he started it at 5:30 a.m., that the diesel engine was destroying the peace and sanctity of the neighborhood, and that appropriate measures would be taken if it continued. The weird part was all the unnecessary details Harold had included. Exact times Bill had started his truck over the past 2 weeks, the duration of how long it idled. Even the license plate number written 3 times at the bottom like some kind of obsessive chant. After that first note, they started appearing everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Stacy from across the circle found one taped to her mailbox complaining about her wind chimes creating sonic pollution and demanding their immediate removal. The Johnsons got one shoved through their mail slot about their recycling bin being placed at a geometrically offensive angle to the curb. Even old Mr. Petrov, who'd lived here longer than anyone and kept to himself tending his vegetable garden, received a 2-page manifesto about his tomato plants attracting pest birds that were defecating on private property. Each note got progressively more hostile, with underlined words and exclamation points scattered throughout like angry little soldiers. Harold had started adding these bizarre diagrams too, sketches of our houses with measurements and angles, photos he'd printed out from his recordings with red circles around supposed violations, and once, disturbingly, a crayon drawing of what looked like a person lying on the ground with X's for eyes. We tried to handle it like reasonable adults at first. We really did. Bill and I walked over to Harold's house on a Saturday afternoon, bringing a 6-pack of beer as a peace offering. Hoping we could talk things out, man. Harold answered the door wearing rubber gloves and a surgical mask, which should have been our first warning that this conversation wasn't going to go well. His living room, what little we could see through the barely cracked door, was lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets, each one labeled with our addresses in label, maker tape. He didn't invite us in. Just stood there breathing heavily through his mask while we tried to explain that his notes were making people uncomfortable. That's when he pulled out this little spiral notebook from his shirt pocket and started reading off violations he'd observed just that morning. The angle of my lawnmower stripes, the number of times Bill's dog barked, 17, apparently, and the suspiciously ethnic smell coming from the Petrovs' kitchen window. When we tried to reason with him, his face turned this alarming shade of purple, and he started jabbing his finger at us, saying we were all conspiring to drive him out because he was the only one who cared about maintaining standards. The situation exploded on that Wednesday in May. A day so humid you could practically swim through the air. I was home early from a job that got postponed, sitting on my porch trying to figure out how to approach the Harold situation, when I heard shouting from the Johnsons' yard. Their kids, twin boys about 10 years old, had been playing with water guns, just being normal kids on a hot day, running around and laughing the way kids should. But Harold had apparently decided that some of the water had splashed onto his driveway, which, in his mind, was tantamount to property damage. By the time I got to their yard, Harold was already there, standing way too close to those boys, his camcorder in one hand and a garden hose in the other. His face was twisted into this expression I'd never seen on another human being before. Pure, irrational rage mixed with something else. Something that made every parental instinct in my body scream danger. He was recording the kids while spraying them with the hose, shouting about teaching them respect for boundaries and how their parents had failed to instill basic human decency. What happened next still plays in my mind like some demented movie scene. Mrs. Johnson came flying out of her house, still wearing her work clothes from the bank, her usually perfect hair coming loose from its bun as she ran. She put herself between Harold and her boys. And that's when Harold did something that shocked everyone who was gathering to watch. He turned the hose on her, full blast, while keeping that camcorder steady in his other hand. But it was what he said that really made everyone gasp. With this eerily calm voice, completely different from his shouting moments before, he looked directly at those terrified kids and said, "Your mother can't protect you forever. Boundaries exist even when parents aren't watching. I know your schedule. I know when you wait for the bus alone." The way he emphasized alone while still filming, water still running from the hose that had dropped to his side. It was like watching someone's last thread of sanity snap in real time. Bill got there before me, grabbed Harold's wrist, and twisted until he dropped the camcorder, which hit the concrete driveway with a satisfying crack. More neighbors started pouring out of their houses. Stacy still in her yoga clothes, Mr. Petrov with dirt-covered gardening gloves. Even the usually absent Martin who worked nights. We formed this protective circle around the Johnson family while Harold stood there, his polo shirt soaked with sweat, alternating between screaming legal threats and muttering about documentation and evidence. His eyes had this glassy, unfocused quality, like he was seeing something completely different from what was actually happening. He kept reaching for his pocket where, apparently, he had another smaller camera, one of those spy pin things. And when Bill grabbed that too, Harold completely lost it. He dropped to his knees on the Johnsons' lawn and started pulling up chunks of grass with his bare hands, throwing them at us while screaming that we were all criminals, that he had files on everyone, that he knew things about us we didn't even know about ourselves. The police arrived within 10 minutes, though it felt like hours standing there watching Harold deteriorate. 2 officers, one young guy who looked fresh out of the academy and an older woman with sergeant stripes who'd clearly seen it all. Harold immediately tried to present his evidence to them, pulling out this thick manila folder from inside his shirt that was soaked with sweat and hose water. Pages scattered everywhere. Photos of our houses with timestamps, transcripts of conversations he'd somehow recorded. Even a hand-drawn map of the Cul-de-Sac with everyone's daily routines mapped out in different colored inks. The sergeant's expression changed from annoyed to concerned when she saw the level of detail in his surveillance, especially the pages dedicated to tracking when the neighborhood kids were home alone. She exchanged a look with her partner that I recognized, same look I'd shared with Janet when we realized our neighbor wasn't just annoying. He was genuinely dangerous. They took Harold away in handcuffs that day, but not before he managed to scream one last thing that still gives me chills when I think about it. As they were putting him in the patrol car, he looked straight at me and said in this sing-song voice, like he was reciting a nursery rhyme, "The electrician leaves at 7:23, returns at 5:47. Wife alone from 8:15 to 4:30. Children wait for bus at 7:45. No adult supervision for exactly 6 minutes." The accuracy of it, the way he'd been watching us that closely, cataloging our lives like we were specimens in some twisted experiment, it made my skin feel too tight for my body. The younger cop actually stopped writing for a second and just stared at Harold, probably wondering the same thing we all were. How long had he been documenting us, and more importantly, what was he planning to do with all that information? We found out later from the sergeant, who stopped by a few days after to follow up, that Harold's house had been like stepping into the mind of someone completely obsessed with control and surveillance. Every room had multiple monitors showing feeds from cameras we hadn't even known existed. Tiny ones hidden in fake rocks along his property line, one in a birdhouse that faced the street, another disguised as a doorbell that could somehow see almost the entire Cul-de-Sac. He had filing cabinets for each house, with subsections for each family member, containing everything from our license plates to our kids' names and birthdays, which he'd somehow figured out. The most disturbing discovery was what they found in his basement. A scale model of our entire Cul-de-Sac, made from cardboard and popsicle sticks. with little figures representing each of us that he could move around to track our movements. Some of the figures had red X's painted on them, including the ones that represented the Johnson twins. The police wouldn't tell us exactly what his notebook said about what those X's meant. But the way the sergeant's jaw tightened when we asked told us everything we needed to know. Harold was charged with stalking, harassment, making threats against minors, and a bunch of other things that the prosecutor said would keep him away for at least a few years. Maybe more if the psych evaluation went the way they expected. But even now, months later, none of us feel quite the same about our little Cul-de-Sac. We all installed better locks, security systems, and yes, cameras of our own. The irony isn't lost on me. The Johnson family moved away in September, said they couldn't look at their yard without seeing Harold standing there with that hose and camera. The rest of us stayed. But here is this unspoken tension now, like we're all waiting for something bad to happen again. Sometimes I catch myself checking my rearview mirror more than necessary when I leave for work, wondering if someone's noting that it's 7:24, not 7:23. The yellow house at the end of the circle sits empty now, with a for escalation sign that's been there so long it's starting to fade. Nobody's even come to look at it. I guess word gets around about houses like that. Places where something went wrong in a way that leaves a stain you can't quite see, but everybody can feel. February of 2022 was when everything started going sideways for my family. I was 36, working remotely as a data analyst, and we had just finished paying off the last of our credit card debt from my wife Laura's medical bills the previous year. Our daughter Olivia had just turned 8. And our son Ethan was 11 and obsessed with building these elaborate Lego cities in our basement. We lived in this cozy two-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood in Madison, Wisconsin. The kind of place where people still borrowed sugar from each other, and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. The house wasn't anything fancy, but it had this huge backyard that backed up to a small creek. And we'd spent 5 years making it ours. Laura's herb garden along the side, my workshop in the garage. The treehouse I'd built with Ethan the summer before. We thought we'd found our forever home. The place where our kids would grow up and bring their own children to visit someday. The first time Richard Brenner knocked on our door, it was a Saturday morning, and I was still in my pajama pants trying to fix the coffee maker that had decided to leak all over the counter. He stood there in his pressed khakis and polo shirt, holding a folder like he was about to give a business presentation. Which I guess he kind of was. Richard lived 3 houses down in this massive McMansion he'd had custom built 2 years earlier, complete with a 4-car garage and one of those circular driveways with a fountain in the middle. He introduced himself, even though we'd waved at each other plenty of times, then launched into this whole spiel about how he wanted to buy our property to expand his estate, talking about market values and investment opportunities, while I stood there with coffee grounds under my fingernails. He'd clearly done his homework, knew exactly what we'd paid for the house, what similar properties were selling for. Even mentioned Laura's job at the elementary school. When I politely told him we weren't interested in selling, he just smiled and said he'd make it worth our while, then left his business card on top of the folder he insisted I keep. Over the next 3 weeks, Richard showed up for more times, always with a new angle. Once he brought comparative property assessments showing how much the neighborhood values had increased. Another time he came with photos of the luxury development he envisioned, complete with architectural renderings that had clearly cost him thousands to commission. The third visit, he brought his wife, Cheryl, this thin woman with platinum blonde hair who kept touching Laura's arm and saying things like, "You could get such a lovely place closer to downtown, and think of all the opportunities for the children." But it was the fourth visit that really set me on edge. He came alone, late on a Wednesday evening when Laura was at her book club, and stood in our doorway talking about how property could be a burden, how maintenance costs could spiral, how one bad storm could destroy everything we'd worked for. His tone never changed from that neighborly concern. But there was something about the way he kept glancing past me into our house, cataloging our belongings like he was already deciding what to do with the space. After that Wednesday night, I told him firmly that we would never sell, that this was our home, and to please stop coming by. Richard just stood there on our porch for a moment, tapping his finger against his thigh in this rhythmic tap, 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 before giving me this strange little nod. "I understand completely," he said, but his eyes were focused somewhere past my shoulder, like he was looking at something only he could see. Sometimes people need time to recognize opportunity. I am a patient man. The way he said patient made my chest tighten, but I figured he'd finally gotten the message. Laura and I even joked about it the next morning, doing impressions of Cheryl's fake sympathy voice while we made breakfast. We thought that was the end of it. Just another quirky rich guy who wasn't used to hearing no Monday morning changed everything. I went out to drive Olivia to school because she'd missed the bus arguing with Ethan about whose turn it was to feed the goldfish, and found all 4 tires on our Subaru completely flat. Not just low on air, slashed, with these long, deliberate cuts that had left rubber ribbons hanging from the side walls. The cuts were declared to be random vandalism, each one precisely placed to make the tire irreparable. While I stood there staring at the damage, trying to process what I was seeing, old Mrs. Hooper from next door shuffled over in her housecoat and mentioned she'd heard some noise around 3 o'clock in the morning, but hadn't wanted to be nosy. "Sounded like someone was out here for a good while," she said, adjusting her thick glasses. "Very methodical. Not like those teenagers who knocked over my garbage cans last Halloween." I called the police, of course, but without cameras or witnesses who actually saw anything. They just filed a report and suggested we might want to install security lights. The mailbox was next. 2 days later, Ethan discovered it when he went to get the mail after school. The whole thing was caved in like someone had taken a baseball bat to it repeatedly. The metal was so mangled that the door wouldn't even close, and our mail was scattered across the lawn, some of it torn open. But here is what really got to me. Whoever did it had been selective. They'd destroyed the junk mail and ads, but carefully placed our personal letters and Olivia's birthday party invitation from her friend back on the porch steps, weighted down with a rock so they wouldn't blow away. Laura wanted to believe it was random, maybe kids being destructive. But I knew better. The precision of it, the message in what was destroyed versus what was preserved. Someone wanted us to know they could get to our personal things whenever they wanted. That night, I caught Richard watching us from his driveway as we cleaned up the mess. Just standing there beside his pristine BMW with his arms crossed, not even pretending to get his own mail or have any reason to be outside. Saturday brought the worst escalation yet. We'd gone to Ethan's soccer game that morning. He played midfielder for the Wildcats and had been practicing penalty kicks all week. When we came home around noon, the front door was wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was even disturbed at first glance, but someone had been inside our house. They'd moved things just enough to let us know they'd been there. Family photos turned backward. Kitchen chairs pulled out at exact angles. Every single cabinet door in the kitchen opened precisely halfway. Upstairs, they'd laid out one outfit on each of our beds. My work clothes, Laura's teaching dress, Ethan's soccer uniform, and Olivia's favorite unicorn pajamas. Each outfit was arranged like the person was lying down. Arms and legs positioned naturally, but where the head should have been. They'd placed a single sheet of paper with our home's original listing photos from when we'd bought it. The message was crystal clear. They knew our routines, our preferences, our lives, and they wanted us gone. Laura called 911 while I checked every room. Every closet, the basement, the attic, my heart hammering against my ribs the entire time. The police took it more seriously this time. Breaking and entering was a felony, after all. They dusted 4 fingerprints, took photos, asked if we had any enemies or anyone who might want to harm us. I mentioned Richard's persistent offers to buy our house, how he'd been increasingly aggressive about it. But the officer just wrote it down without much reaction. A rich neighbor wanting to buy property didn't exactly scream probable cause, especially since Richard had been at the country club all morning with 40 witnesses, as we learned later. The detective suggested we stay with family for a few days while they investigated, but Laura refused to be driven from our home. That night, she sat in our bedroom with a baseball bat beside the bed while I installed new deadbolts and window locks. Both of us jumping at every creak and settling sound the house made. Olivia ended up sleeping in our bed, curled between us like she used to when she was 3 and afraid of thunderstorms. The next morning, Sunday, I decided to confront Richard directly. I walked down to his house around 9, past the elaborate landscaping with those perfectly trimmed hedges that probably cost more to maintain than our mortgage payment. His doorbell played some classical piece I didn't recognize, and Cheryl answered, wearing tennis whites even though their court was covered in snow. She tried to tell me Richard wasn't home, but I could see him through their floor, 2 ceiling windows, sitting in what looked like a library or office. When he finally came to the door, he acted genuinely confused by my accusations. His face this perfect mask of concern and surprise. "These are serious allegations," he said, inviting me in for coffee like we were discussing lawn care. His study was filled with aerial photos of the neighborhood, surveys, property lines marked in red ink, and at the center of his desk was a scale model of what our block could look like with our house conspicuously absent, replaced by an extended garden and pool house. Vision planning, he called it when he saw me staring. I am a firm believer in manifesting the future you want to see. When I told him I knew he was behind the harassment, that he needed to stop immediately or I'd get a restraining order, Richard did something that chilled me more than any threat could have. He pulled out a leather journal and began reading dates and times. Every time our dog had barked for more than 5 minutes. Every time Ethan's basketball had bounced into his yard. Every time we'd put our garbage cans out too early or left them at the curb too long. He had 2 years of what he called neighborhood disturbances meticulously documented, complete with photos and videos stored on his tablet. "I believe in being thorough," he said, closing the journal with a soft snap. "You'd be amazed how useful documentation can be when dealing with difficult neighbors. Property disputes can get so ugly, especially when code enforcement gets involved. Did you know your shed is actually 18 inches over the setback requirement? And that treehouse? I don't recall seeing any permits for that construction." His smile never wavered as he showed me to the door, patting my shoulder like we were old friends. "I do hope your family starts feeling safer soon. Moving can be such a stressful experience, but sometimes it's the best solution for everyone involved." That afternoon, I installed security cameras around our property, the expensive kind that save to the cloud and sent alerts to your phone. Laura and I spent hours researching restraining order requirements, but everything we read said we needed concrete proof of threats or harassment directly linked to Richard. Documentation of our code violations wasn't illegal, and him wanting to buy our house wasn't a crime. We felt trapped in this bizarre psychological warfare, where every move had been calculated to leave us without recourse. Around 6 that evening, while Laura was helping Olivia with homework and Ethan was in his room, I noticed movement in our backyard through the new camera app. Someone in dark clothing was standing at the edge of our property line, just outside the range of our motion lights, holding what looked like a surveyor's pole. They stood there for exactly 1 hour, not moving, except to occasionally write something in a notebook, then walked away through the creek bed. When I checked the footage later, zooming in as much as the resolution allowed, I could see it was a professional surveyor's tripod. And the person was wearing an official-looking vest, but surveyors don't work Sunday evenings. And when I called the county office Monday morning, they had no record of any approved survey work on our street. The breaking point came that Monday night. I'd just gotten the kids to bed after a dinner where nobody really ate much. Everyone pushing food around their plates and jumping whenever a car drove by. Laura was in the shower when our new cameras started sending alert after alert to my phone. Someone was walking around our house, methodically triggering each camera in sequence. But when I looked at the live feeds, I couldn't see anyone. They'd figured out the blind spots, the exact angles where they could move without being fully visible. Just catching enough motion to set off the alerts. Then the power went out, not just our house, but the whole block. As I could see from the window, except for Richard's house. His place was lit up like a Christmas display, every window glowing. And I could swear I saw multiple figures moving around inside, way more than just him and Cheryl. The power came back on after exactly 15 minutes, and when it did, we found a manila envelope tucked into our front door that hadn't been there before. Inside was a cashier's check for triple what our house was worth, and a contract already filled out with our names, just waiting for signatures. At the bottom, in Richard's neat handwriting, final offer. Decision needed by Friday. RB. That's when Laura did something I didn't expect. She took the check and contract, walked into the kitchen, and started making phone calls. Not to lawyers or the police, but to her brother, Paul, who worked in commercial real estate. Her cousin, who was a private investigator, and then, surprisingly, to Richard's business partners. Turns out she'd spent her Sunday doing her own research while I was confronting him. Richard's development company was in the final stages of a major deal with a Korean investment firm. Something worth hundreds of millions, and any scandal could destroy it. She also discovered he'd done this before. Twice in different states, same pattern, same escalation, families mysteriously deciding to sell after months of random incidents. By midnight, she had compiled everything into a folder thicker than the one Richard had first brought to our door. The next morning, instead of going to work, she drove to Richard's company headquarters downtown and waited in the lobby until his business partners agreed to see her. I don't know exactly what she said in that meeting, but she came home with a different kind of smile. The one she used to have when she'd successfully negotiated with difficult parents at school. Wednesday morning, 2 days before Richard's deadline, we woke up to find his house completely dark and a moving truck in his driveway. Richard was directing movers with the kind of efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first sudden relocation. Richard himself stood in his garage, watching them load boxes, and when he saw me getting the newspaper, he didn't wave or smile or acknowledge me at all. He just turned and walked back inside. By Thursday evening, they were gone. The house left empty with a for sale sign from a national realty company. Mrs. Hooper later told me she'd heard from her bridge club that Richard's company had restructured him into early retirement and that they'd relocated to somewhere in Florida or maybe Texas. The details were fuzzy. We never cashed the check, of course. Laura had it framed and hung it in our hallway as what she calls a reminder that bullies only understand one language. The kids started sleeping in their own beds again after about a month. And we finally took down the extra security cameras after 6 months. Sometimes I still catch myself checking the street when unfamiliar cars drive by slowly. And Laura installed one of those video doorbells that lets you see who's there before answering. But we're still here. In our house with the creek in the back and the possibly illegal treehouse. In the shed that's apparently 18 inches too close to something. Because this is our home, and nobody, no matter how much money they have or how methodical their campaign is, gets to take that away from us. I used to live in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. The kind of place where most people waved at each other, and the days blended into a predictable rhythm. At that time, I was working long shifts at a small accounting office, and I often left early in the morning and came back well after sunset. My life was, wake up, drive to work, grab groceries, repeat. I didn't socialize much with my neighbors, but I knew them by sight. One of them stood out, though, an older man named Mr. Howard, who lived 2 houses down. He was retired, usually sitting on his porch with a thermos in hand, always watching the street like it was his personal television channel. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was older, maybe just bored. And I figured keeping an eye on the block gave him something to do, but gradually, I noticed he always seemed to appear at the exact moment I was leaving for work or coming back home. It didn't matter if I left at dawn, noon, or late at night, there he was. Either on the porch or casually walking down the sidewalk like he just happened to be out at that very moment. It was strange enough to make me uneasy, but not enough for me to confront him. I told myself it was a coincidence. Still, that gnawing awareness grew every single week. One evening, I got home later than usual, maybe close to midnight. The air was still and the neighborhood quiet, but as I pulled into my driveway, I caught a glimpse of something across the street. Mr. Howard was standing in his yard, not on his porch, and his posture wasn't relaxed like before. He was stiff, upright, and facing directly toward my car. My headlights hit his face for a split second, and instead of being startled or looking away, he just stood there, motionless, as if he had been waiting. I remember sitting in my car for a moment longer than usual, debating whether to pretend I hadn't seen him or acknowledge it. Eventually, I walked inside without a word. Locking the door behind me that night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't just the idea of him being outside. It was how calculated it felt, like he knew the exact minute I'd be back. The next morning, when I stepped outside for work, I caught myself scanning the street, expecting to see him, and sure enough, he was there again, leaning against his porch railing, sipping from that dented thermos. His eyes followed me as I got into my car. He gave me a polite little nod. But there was something unsettling about how precise his timing always was. That was the moment I stopped believing it was a coincidence. The idea of being monitored ate at me during the following week. I tried switching up my schedule, leaving earlier, staying late at work, even sneaking out to grab coffee in the middle of the afternoon. But no matter what time I stepped outside, there he was. Sometimes he'd be on the porch, other times standing by his mailbox fiddling with envelopes that didn't exist. Once, I even caught him trimming his hedge with a pair of dull garden shears in the dark, no lights on, just waiting until I turned my car on before he casually walked back inside. The pattern wasn't just weird anymore. It was deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had some way of knowing exactly when I was about to leave. One Saturday, I finally decided to test my theory. I turned off all the lights in my house, parked my car down the block earlier that day, and sat in my living room window watching his place. Hours passed, nothing unusual, just him sitting on his porch. Same as always. But when I quietly stepped outside and walked toward my driveway, I noticed something I hadn't before. Right above his garage, tucked between the siding and the gutter, was a small, black device angled in a way that pointed directly at my driveway. From where I stood, it looked like a camera lens. Faintly reflecting the porch light, my chest tightened. That explained everything. He wasn't just guessing. He was watching. I tried to convince myself maybe it was a security camera meant for his own yard. But the angle gave that lie away immediately. It was pointed squarely at my driveway and the front windows of my house. I went back inside, pulled the curtains shut, and paced the living room for what felt like an hour. Confronting him didn't feel safe, but ignoring it made me sick. I thought about calling the police. But what if they dismissed it as just an old man trying to feel secure? I pictured myself sounding paranoid, like some overreacting neighbor. Still, I couldn't unsee it, the way the lens caught the light, aimed like a rifle sight into my private space. The next few days, I lived like someone under surveillance. I double-checked the locks, moved around my house with curtains drawn, even parked in different spots to throw him off. Once, when I glanced out late at night, I swore I saw the faint red glow of a light coming from that camera, pulsing like it was recording. The thought that he might be sitting inside his living room, watching my comings and goings in real time, made my skin crawl. It wasn't just unnerving. It felt invasive in a way that was impossible to ignore anymore. By the following weekend, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked a friend from work, Daniel, to come over and take a look. He had some background in home repairs and security systems, so I trusted his judgment. We stood in my driveway, pretending to chat casually while he angled his eyes toward the device on Mr. Howard's garage. After a few seconds, he whispered, "That's a camera. Not even hidden well, just stuck up there with a mount. And yeah, it's aimed right at your place." Hearing someone else confirm what I already knew sent a shiver through me. This wasn't paranoia. It was deliberate surveillance that night. I dialed the Nantes emergency police line till officers came by, listened to my explanation, and then walked over to Mr. Howard's property. I watched from my living room window as they spoke to him. He gestured a lot, pointing at the street, shaking his head. Eventually, one of the officers motioned toward the camera, and after a tense few minutes, I saw them remove it from his garage. When they came back, they told me he claimed it was for neighborhood safety, but because it was pointed into my property, they made him take it down immediately. They suggested I install my own cameras if I wanted peace of mind, and then left. The following days were awkward. I still saw him outside, still sipping from his thermos, still pretending to water plants that didn't need watering. But without that camera staring me down every time I left the house, the weight lifted a little. He never apologized, never spoke a word about it, but his presence lost some of its power. I kept my curtains drawn and avoided eye contact. And eventually, his constant appearances at my exact leaving times became less frequent. Maybe he knew he'd been caught. Or maybe the thrill was gone now that the camera was gone. Either way, the silence was a relief. Even now, years later, I sometimes think back to that period and how easily someone can cross the line between neighborly watchfulness and predatory control. It wasn't dramatic in the sense of violence or threats, but it taught me how fragile the idea of privacy really is. Every time I see a small black lens on the side of a house, I can't help but wonder who it's pointed at and what story the person on the other end is telling themselves to justify it. For me, that little device changed how I look at my own home forever.